There is a staircase in southern Egypt that goes down into the river and stops underwater. It was not built to reach the water. It was built to read it. The steps are cut into rock on the island of Elephantine, at the southern edge of the country, and the wall beside them carries marks. Every summer the Nile rose and a man walked down those steps until the water stopped him and read the level against the wall. That reading decided how much land could be planted, how much grain each district owed the state, and whether a village 200 miles north would eat in 14 months. Stand on that step in July and you have one job. Look at Whetstone and tell a kingdom how many people it can feed next year. Be wrong by the width of a hand, and you have mispriced an entire province. Everything else here is built on top of that number. But to understand the mark on the wall, you have to start much lower down in the mud. Forget the green valley in your head. Egypt is desert, sand and rock from the Red Sea to Libya, with a strip of black soil running through it that in most places you can walk across in under an hour. The Egyptians named the two things separately, the Black Land and the Red Land. You lived in one, the other killed you. That strip existed for one reason. Once a year, rain falling on the Ethiopian highlands, more than 1,000 miles upstream, pushed a flood down the river that spilled over the banks and laid down a fresh layer of silt. The people living on it had no idea where that water came from. What they had instead was a record kept for centuries of how high it came and what happened afterward. And here is the part that gets skipped. They did not let the flood do the work. A river that simply rises and falls across a field gives you wet ground, then baked ground and nothing worth harvesting. So they cut the floodplain into basins, earth walls called dikes, thrown up in grids across the fields, some of them enclosing areas you would need most of an hour to walk around. When the flood came, water was let in through gaps, and then the gaps were closed, and the water sat there, trapped, for roughly 40 to 60 days. That waiting is the whole technique. Still water drops its load. The silt settles out onto the field in a layer of fresh soil, and the standing water pushes salt down below the root line instead of letting it climb to the surface and poison the ground. Farmland in other river systems went sterile with salt over centuries. Egypt kept farming the same fields for thousands of years, and the reason is that every year the water was made to sit still long enough. Then it was released downstream into the next basin or back to the river on a schedule. Get that timing wrong, and you have either drowned seed or dust. Now pull that off with no cement, no pumps, and no way to reach a man 10 miles downstream except by sending someone to walk there. The dikes were earth and had to be rebuilt constantly, and every village's water depended on the village upriver honoring the schedule. Which raises the obvious problem. The flood filled the basins. What filled a garden in March? Your shoulders. The answer that mattered came in during the New Kingdom, around 3,500 years ago, and we know it from tomb paintings. It is called a shaduf, a pole balanced on an upright frame, with a bucket on one end and a heavy lump of mud or stone on the other. You pull the bucket down into the river, and the counterweight does most of the work of lifting the full bucket back up. Swing it, tip it into the channel, drop it again, it looks like nothing. It is a lever and a rock. But a man working one all day moves thousands of gallons up a bank, and that is the difference between a strip of vegetables and bare dirt. And notice what is not there. No water wheel, no screw. The animal-driven wheel and the screw pump arrive in Egypt much later, in the Greek period, more than 1,000 years after the pyramids at Giza. For most of the time we are talking about water went uphill on a lever or on a human back in a jar. There are no camels either, not in pharaonic Egypt. They come late. Everything crossing that desert crossed it on donkeys or on feet. So the flood is measured, the fields are flooded on purpose, the water is lifted. Now you have grain. And grain is where a lot of societies quietly failed, because grain rots and grain gets eaten by things smaller than you. The main crop was emmer wheat, a hulled wheat, which means the grain does not thresh free of its husk. That sounds like a defect. It is protection. Stored in the husk, the grain resists insects and moisture far better, and Egyptian storage worked with that instead of against it. The husk was pounded off in batches when the grain was needed, not before. We have models of the granaries carved and painted, put in tombs so the dead would keep eating. Thick mud brick, domed, filled through a hatch in the roof, and drawn out through a small opening at the bottom, so the oldest grain came out first and nothing sat at the base going bad. The enemy was damp and the weevil, and every part of that design aims at those two. Hold that thought about the weevil. It comes back. Now the water you actually drink. You are standing beside the largest river in the region, and it is brown with the silt you just farmed with, and full of everything a river carries through settled country. So it was not drunk straight. Water was carried in jars and left to stand until the sediment dropped, and the clear water was poured off the top. There is a decent argument that plant material was sometimes added to make the silt clump and fall faster. Slow, and it removes a large part of what would otherwise end up in your gut. The jars themselves did something else. Unglazed clay is slightly porous. Water seeps through to the outside surface and evaporates into dry air, and evaporation pulls heat out of what is left behind. A jar sitting in a doorway in a breeze holds water noticeably cooler than the air around it, in a country where summer afternoons can put the air past 110 degrees. No ice, no shade tree required. Just the right clay, left slightly thirsty. Then there is beer, and here you have probably been told something wrong. The line that Egyptians drank beer because it was safer than water is repeated everywhere, and it is not established. Egyptian beer was thick, low in alcohol, made from emmer, closer to a soured porridge than to anything you would order today, and it was drunk by workers and priests and children because it was food, calories, B vitamins, and a way to store a harvest in liquid form. Deir el-Medina, the village of the men who cut the royal tombs, was paid in grain, and beer and bread were the wage in usable form. Their bread had one flaw they could not solve: sand. It got into the grinding stones and into the flour, and Egyptian teeth show it. Look at the molars of mummies, and you find enamel ground flat, sometimes down into the pulp, in people in their 30s. An abscessed tooth in that world was not a dental problem. It was a way to die. Now the house. Egypt in summer is an oven, and the roof over your head is doing thermal work whether you understand it or not. Houses were mud brick, made from Nile silt and chopped straw, formed in wooden molds and dried in the sun. Cheap, endlessly repairable, and heavy. That weight is the point. A thick mud wall soaks up heat all day and releases it slowly, so the inside stays cooler than the air outside while the sun is up, and warmer through a desert night that can drop shockingly fast. Windows were small and set high to let hot air out near the ceiling without letting the sun in at eye level. And on some roofs there was a scoop. We can see one in a painting from the house of a New Kingdom official named Nebamun, a raised structure angled to catch the prevailing north wind and funnel it down into the rooms below. The same idea, under the name Malkaf, is still built across the region today. Air pushed down a shaft, moving across bodies in a house with no moving parts. The roof itself was living space. In hot months you slept on it, above the flies, under the wind. Your clothing worked the same way. Linen from flax grown in those irrigated fields, woven fine enough that surviving pieces are startling to handle, loose, pale, breathable, washable. Wool existed, carried religious restrictions, and was the wrong fabric for that heat anyway. Heads were shaved, not for fashion first. Lice in a hot valley with crowded housing are relentless, and a shaved scalp removes the problem at the root. Wigs went on over the top, elaborate ones, human hair set with beeswax and resin, and a wig sits slightly off the scalp with air moving underneath it. So the formal look of Egyptian society is underneath a lice strategy with ventilation. None of that helps you when something breaks. Around 3,600 years ago, somebody copied out a much older medical text, and it survives as the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It is a surgical manual, and it is organized in a way that stops you cold. Injuries are listed from the head downward, and each one is written as a case: the examination, the findings, then a verdict. There are 3 verdicts: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, an ailment not to be treated. That third category is the one that matters. It is a scribe writing down in a manual meant for use that certain injuries cannot be saved and telling the practitioner not to pretend otherwise. That is triage, written out and taught. And it means somebody kept records long enough to know which wounds killed regardless of what was done. The descriptions are physical and unsentimental. Crushed skulls, with the surface of the brain described as ridged like molten metal cooling. Neck injuries where the man cannot move his arms or legs, noted without a cure. Broken collarbones set by pulling the shoulders back. Splints of wood padded with linen found on mummies still in place on limbs broken before death. Do not oversell it. The same medical tradition includes spells, and other papyri are full of remedies that did nothing at all. But sitting inside that is a body of observation built by people who cut open the injured for centuries and wrote down what they saw. They also had an eye problem. Trachoma and other infections thrive in a hot valley thick with flies, and blindness shows up constantly in Egyptian texts, including instructions for the care of blind workers, which brings up the black eye paint. There is a modern hypothesis from chemical work on surviving samples that certain lead salts in it may have triggered a mild immune response in the skin around the eye. It is argued over, and it is still lead, so file it as an open question. The simpler function is not in doubt. A wide band of dark pigment under the eye cuts glare the same way a modern athlete's grease paint does, in a place where the sun comes at you twice, once from the sky and once off the ground. Now the part that gets left out of every documentary about this place. They went into the desert on purpose. West of the Nile, out in the Sand Sea, there is a site called Abu Balas, the Hill of Pots. Scattered there and at other points along a line running southwest are the remains of hundreds of large water jars, deposits, placed in advance by people walking out from the valley so that a donkey caravan could cross ground with no water on it at all by moving from cache to cache. That is a supply chain, run on foot and on donkey, across open desert, hundreds of miles long. It only works if the jars are where they should be, if nobody has broken them, and if you can navigate to a spot in featureless sand on landmarks, stars and memory. Miss a cache out there, and there is no second chance. A person walking that ground loses water faster than they can carry it. Meanwhile, the easy road was the river, and the river was rigged in their favor. The current runs north. The prevailing wind blows south. So you sail upstream and drift downstream, and the writing system knows it. The hieroglyph for traveling south is a boat with its sail up. The sign for traveling north is a boat with the sail down. That is a country that moved stone, grain, soldiers, and taxes on a road that never needed repair, and had the sense to build its calendar, its capital cities, and its economy along it. Which is a good moment to kill the oldest myth about this place. The pyramids were not built by slave gangs under a whip. The workers' settlements have been dug up. We have the bakeries, the cattle bone from thousands of animals, the ration records, and the workers' own cemeteries with their bodies in them. Those skeletons show heavy labor and worn joints, and they also show healed fractures set and mended, and amputations survived. Somebody treated these people and they went back to work, organized crews, fed by the state. The system was not gentle. It was not a slave pen. We know it because they complained and it was written down. In the 29th year of Rameses III, the tomb workers at Deir el-Medina did not receive their grain on time. They walked off the job, sat down at the mortuary temples and refused to move. It is the first recorded labor strike we have anywhere. The record survives because a scribe wrote down the delay, the protest and the negotiation, the way he wrote down absences from work for other reasons, including hangovers and a wife giving birth. That is what the whole system looked like from the inside. Ordinary people on a wage of bread and beer, tracking whether the state kept its side of the arrangement. Now go back to the staircase, because a mark on that wall could come in too low. The flood was not reliable. It was probable. And a run of low floods meant the basins never filled, the silt never landed, and the seed grain in those domed granaries had to feed people instead of going into the ground. We have their words for it. A regional governor named Anktifi, writing more than 4,000 years ago during the collapse between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, describes the whole country in hunger, and people reduced to things he says he will not write down. He is boasting about his own generosity, so read the scale with suspicion. But there is other evidence for climate failure in that period, and the state that had run the water for centuries came apart with it. There is also a famous stone near Aswan describing 7 years of failed flood under an early king named Djoser. It reads like the oldest famine record in Egypt. It is not. It was carved more than 2,000 years after the reign it describes, by priests with a stake in the outcome. And that fear is the honest answer to what all of this was. The Nilometer, the dikes, the sealed granaries, the ration lists, the scribes counting sacks in a hot doorway. None of it made the flood arrive. It bought time. It let a country survive one bad year, and sometimes 3, and then it ran out, like everything does. The flood itself is gone now. The last natural inundation of the Nile came in 1970, before the high dam at Aswan closed, and the water was held permanently upstream. The rhythm that shaped every one of these techniques, for something like 5,000 years, has not happened in the lifetime of most people watching this, which leaves you with the steps. Every one of these things was ordinary. A child in that valley knew when the water came and what a low mark meant. She knew how long the basin had to stand, why the grain stayed in its husk, which jar kept water cool, which wound the doctors would not take, and which way the sail went. It was not learning. It was the shape of the year, held in the body. Go stand on that wet stone in July and read the wall, you would not know what you were looking at.